Okay, hi everyone. It's really good to get up here again. Even drag my mum up with us, which is good. I think a lot of you know her. She came to the Lord here over 50 years ago. So if you don't know my mum, she's in the green over there next to Michelle. Say hello to her afterwards. Okay, I've got a presentation. So you will use your Bibles, but I'm going to have slides up here as we go through, and I've got a little thing here that I hope I get right. It's on. Okay. Hopefully. There it is. It gets up there. Okay, if you want to turn to the book of Daniel. So this talk actually was, I don't know if inspired's the right word, but it started back in Easter camp. You may or may not remember, Pastor Mark gave a talk where he spoke a lot out of Daniel. And he started reading this passage, and I got to one word, which is the word that's up there, Syriac. And I stopped, like, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? And then I started looking at the footnotes, and I started then digging and went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I don't know what happened to the rest of the talk because I was doing my own research, but that's where this talk came from. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today, and it's going to be maybe a bit more of an in-depth Bible study than maybe would normally happen, but hopefully you find it as interesting as I did. So Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. I'm just going to stop there. So that was that word that got me stumped. What does that mean? It actually means Aramaic. They spoke to him in Aramaic. So Aramaic was the administrative language of the time and the region. Maybe a bit like English is a language often used in business around the world. Or when I was in East Africa last year and this year, Swahili is a bit of a language that's spoken. So each country will have their own language, but Swahili is a common language that might be spoken amongst East Africans. So Aramaic was like that. Each country had their own language, but they would speak when they came together in Aramaic. Okay, so I'm going to take a backward step now. Let's talk a little bit about the background to Daniel himself and this book. I'm going to take us back probably a few hundred years from when this was written. So many of us know the nation of Israel was sort of formed and had kings. The first king was King Saul, then King David and King Solomon. They're around about 1000 BC. After King Solomon reigned, his son Rehoboam came on the scene, made some pretty poor choices, which led to the kingdom breaking into two. You had the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which took on the name Judah, from which the word Jew comes from. Over a few hundred years, they went along, did their thing. Sometimes they're enemies, sometimes they're kind of friendly with each other. But eventually, the northern kingdom of Israel got taken into captivity by the nation called Assyria. And the southern kingdom remained. And it was in around about 600 BC or 605 BC, another very big kingdom called Babylon. They came in and they captured or destroyed or captured Judah. And at that time, in about 605 BC, they started taking people from Judah to Babylon and other places of their kingdom. And Daniel was one of those people. He was taken captive at that time in about 605 BC. Daniel was most likely in his mid to late teens, so a young man or late teenager. And he was also part of the nobility in Jerusalem. And he was potentially part of the royal family. It talks about them taking the princes, and Daniel being one of those princes. And for the rest of Daniel's life, which was a long one, he lived in Babylon. never ever returned to Jerusalem. He eventually saw the fall of the Babylonian kingdom and the rise of the subsequent kingdom, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's actually possible that Daniel was still alive when the exiles returned to Jerusalem. That happened roughly 70 years after, and he was there possibly around that time. We know that Daniel was alive in Babylon in 586, which is when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. And at that time, the contents of the temple, all the cups, the vessels, all the precious stuff was taken by the Babylonians from Jerusalem back to Babylon. Okay, now does this work? Pointing that way? That didn't work. I'll try again. No, that's on or not. That's not working. I'm going to have to say next, unfortunately. Oh, there we go. Good. 2, 3, 4, 7. Okay. Let's go back to the Syriac, Aramaic. So why would I even worry about that? Well, when I started digging into it, it turns out that from that point until the end of chapter 7, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Now, you might go, who cares? Why? Why do we care? Well, actually, almost all of the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. There's only a couple of the chapters in, I think, Nehemiah, that is also in Aramaic. But these 6 chapters were written in Aramaic. The rest of Daniel was written in Hebrew. Got me thinking, why would he do that? Why would he write part of his Daniel in another language? And when I did a bit of digging and research into it and a bit more thinking, I realised he wanted to tell the people who he came in contact with about his God. He wanted to tell the people who weren't Jews, who didn't speak Hebrew, he wanted the people who spoke Aramaic, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the others, about his God. So he wrote it in their language. But why? What would he want to tell them? Well, that's what the rest of that talks about. That's not working again. I'll just go say next, sorry. Okay. So he actually uses 6 stories. So there's 6 chapters. Each chapter is a story. And these stories are set over a period of 65 years. And they're things that happened in his life or things that he saw. And the 6 stories are, in chapter 2, the interpretation of the statue from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We'll go into these in a little bit more detail later if you're not so familiar with them. In chapter 3, he shares the fiery furnace. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace. In chapter 4, he talks about Nebuchadnezzar living as a beast. In chapter 5, he talks about the writing on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. In chapter 6, he talks about Daniel in the lion's den. And in chapter 7, the vision of the four beasts. Here's the vision he had himself. So we'll go, I'm not going to spend too long on each of those, but maybe summarize these as we go through. But when we look at these stories overall, what they show us, they actually show us examples of God's power, including his ability to predict the future, his ability to protect, and to pass judgment. These stories include kings from multiple kingdoms or multiple empires testifying of God's power. And they also include personal testimonies of Daniel himself. So in addition to this, there's actually a structure behind these stories, which I want to talk a little bit about, because it actually helps you bring out a few more things. And we don't often see these structures, because sometimes we're reading it in English, they're written in another language. Sometimes these structures are hidden in this other language you don't know. This is more of an overarching structure. But these 6 chapters use a literary technique, which is very common in Jewish writing, not just Jewish, but also the regions around about, called a chiasm. Has anyone heard of that word before? Chiasm? No? I had never heard of it before. This either. So in that structure, it actually pairs stories. So, for example, next, okay, chapter 2 and chapter 7, they're paired. Next, please. Okay, chapter 3 and chapter 6 are paired. I'll try it one more time. Well, chapter 4 and chapter 5 are paired. Okay, so we're going to look at these chapters together, so the paired chapters together, and see what they tell us. What do they tell us about Daniel's God, who happens to be our God? Okay. Well, that worked that time. That's good. Okay, so chapters 2 and chapter 7, if you want to summarize chapter 2 and chapter 7, they basically teach us that God is all-knowing. He knows the end from the beginning. So, for example, in chapter 2, in the very beginning of the chapter, God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and then he calls together all the wise men, the sorcerers, magicians, and he says to them, I had this dream. You need to tell me what it is, what the dream was, and what it means. And they said, okay, that's easy. You just tell us what the dream is, then we'll tell you what it means. And he goes, no, that's cheating. You tell me the dream first, and then tell me the interpretation. They said, we can't do that. In fact, no one can do that. Only the gods can do that. And he got Nebuchadnezzar pretty angry. And he basically said, I'm going to kill all the magicians. You're all frauds. If you can't tell me what my dream was, you're frauds. And then the news gets back to Daniel, who was living in Babylon at the time, and he was going to be one of those people who were going to be killed. And he finds out why, and he goes, okay, I'm going to pray to my God, and God reveals the dream to him and the interpretation of that dream to him. And without going into too much detail, the dream was of this statue. The statue was made out of 4 main parts. They had a head made out of gold, and that gold represented the Babylonian kingdom. They had a chest of silver, which represented the Medo-Persian Empire. It had hips of brass, which represented the Greek Empire, and it had legs of iron, which represented the Roman Empire. And then it had feet of iron and clay, which I won't go into. That's another story. But here's God revealing this, that he knows the future of mankind. He knows that after Babylon's going to come the Medo-Persians, which did, followed by the Greeks, which did, followed by the Romans, which did. So that's chapter 2. If we go to chapter 7, Daniel now has a dream. He has a vision. And in this vision, he sees 4 beasts. And in the vision, he's given the interpretation of the vision. And that these 4 beasts also represent 4 empires. They're the same 4 empires as chapter 2. So he sees this beast, a lion with eagle's wings, which is the Babylonian kingdom. He then sees a bear, which has 3 ribs in its mouth, which is the Medo-Persian Empire. He sees a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, which is the Greek Empire, and a beast with iron teeth and 10 horns, which is the Roman Empire. So you can see these visions, these chapters 2 and chapter 7, talking about the same thing. They're paired. Now, if you've got your Bibles, chapter 2 in verse 44. So I guess what that's showing is God knows the future of mankind. But in chapter 2, verse 44, it says, and in those days, in the days of these kings, so that's the final king, the leg of iron, or the final beast. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And if you flick over to chapter 7 and verse 27, Daniel 7, verse 27, we read a very similar thing here. And it says, and the kingdom and dominion And the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So both of these chapters talk about God predicting these empires hundreds of years before they happened. But he also says that there will come a time in the last of those kingdoms that he would set up his own kingdom. We know that's talking about Jesus Christ, setting up a stone kingdom it talks about in Daniel chapter 2. And that kingdom will last forever. And we read in Daniel chapter 7, it talks about that will be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is everlasting kingdom. Again, we're talking about the same things. Chapter 2 and chapter 7, they're talking about God knows the end from the beginning. He has a plan, which we're part of. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so chapters 3 and chapter 6 now. And again, if I was to sum these up, it's about God is the only one to be worshipped, basically. And God will protect those who are faithful to him. So, chapter 3, I'll summarize it and then we'll read a little bit because there's a lot of words here, so we won't read it all. So now we'll still go back to the man Nebuchadnezzar, the king. And now he set up this golden statue and he says, everyone needs to fall down and worship this statue. When you hear the music, there's going to be a band. I won't list all the instruments. When you hear that music, you need to bow down to this statue that I've set up. And if you don't, I'm going to cast you into the fire. You can be burnt to death. Now, 3 other Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were there with Daniel in Babylon, and they didn't bow down. They would not bow down to it. And because of that, the others saw they didn't bow down. They went to Nebuchadnezzar and said, these 3 men, they haven't done what you said. They haven't bowed down. And we'll pick that up in chapter 3 and verse 16. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he'll deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Here it is. They won't worship a false god. They will only worship the true God. Now let's sort of pivot to chapter 6. Now, this is talking about Daniel himself. We're actually a fair way down the track now. We're now into the Medo-Persian Empire. There's another king called Darius. And Daniel at this stage had been raised to a very high level in a very, very high-ranking public servant, basically. And the other officials were jealous. And they said, if we can get rid of Daniel, let's try to get rid of Daniel. So we're going to go to the king, Darius, and we're going to make him, tell him, if we're going to make a rule that no one can ask any other petition, no one can pray or ask anything from any other person or God apart from you, otherwise they'll be punished. They'll be thrown into the lion's den. And the king said, that sounds pretty good. I'll sign that. But they knew that Daniel wouldn't follow that. So they watched him, and Daniel didn't follow that. He did what he normally did. 3 times a day, he'd go to his room and he'd pray. And they caught him in the act. They took him and they explained to King Darius what had happened. And he had no choice. He had to throw him into the lion's den because that's what he had said. So again, we hear the story. They will not worship any other god. The second part of that, though, is God's people who have faith in him, he works miracles to protect them. So again, we'll go back to chapter 3. So in the story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we know they were protected in the fiery furnace. They got thrown into the furnace, and King Nebuchadnezzar's watching, and he goes, didn't we just throw 3 people in there? But there's a 4th person in there, and he looks like a son of God. And we know in the story they were protected. They came out completely delivered by God. In chapter 6, we'll read about Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Chapter 6 and verse 19. He'd been thrown into the lion's den. The king himself was really worried, and he stayed up all night worrying about it. And then verse 19, chapter 6. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. When he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou serves continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. So here again, God protects those who remain faithful to him. So if I want to sum up those stories, God's people won't worship other gods. They'll only worship true God, and God will protect them. But there's another interesting part with these stories, and we just keep reading in verse 25 of chapter 6. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall even be unto the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Here is Darius, the king, testifies of the miraculous protection of God. And don't turn to about in Daniel 3, verse 28 to 29, is a very similar thing from Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted him, and has changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So people can see the power of God. Even people who don't worship God, they can see it and they can testify of it. And that's what happened in these stories. Okay, I forgot to show my little pictures. There we go. There's the 4 people in the fire, and there's Daniel in the lion's den. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. I'll let you look at those for a little bit. No, there we go. Okay, chapters 4 and 5. Okay, so again, what are these talking about? Well, these teach about honouring God and giving him the glory. It also talks about those who exalt themselves or are proud, God will humble or judge. Okay, so in chapter 4, there's a little bit of reading in this section, so apologies for that, but I'll set the scene a little bit first before we read. Going back to Nebuchadnezzar again. So Nebuchadnezzar, he now has another dream. And in this dream, he dreams of this massive tree that reaches all the way into heaven. And in the tree, all sorts of birds sit, and then the tree's cut down. And he's a bit worried about it. What does this mean? So again, he seeks the interpretation from Daniel. And Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that he is the tree. The tree represents Nebuchadnezzar. But that tree will be cut down. And the interpretation of that meaning is that Nebuchadnezzar, he'll be cut down. He'll live as a beast in the field until it says 7 times. Don't exactly know how long that is. Maybe it was 7 years, maybe or some other period of time. And at the end of giving the interpretation, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, but if you stop sinning, if you show mercy to the poor, maybe God won't do it to you. He warns him. Okay, so we'll pick it up in chapter 4, verse 30. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honour of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honoured him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So that's what happened in chapter 4 to Nebuchadnezzar. So he didn't humble himself. He was proud, but God humbled him. But then he recognized and honored God in the end, and God restored him. Okay, so we turn to chapter 5. So chapter 5 is talking about a man called Belshazzar. Now, it refers to him as, says that Nebuchadnezzar was his father. We'll read that shortly. But what that means is he was an ancestor. It's most likely his grandfather, just if you're wondering. So this is a few years on. So now Belshazzar had made this big feast, called a huge feast. And he called for all the gold and silver vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and that he'd brought back to Babylon. He called for them to come to his feast, and they wanted to use those to drink wine from them and praise the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. And as they're doing that, all of a sudden, this man's hand appeared and wrote on the wall, "Meeny, meeny, tickle you fasten." Now, he freaked out. I think all of us would, wouldn't you? All of a sudden, you see a hand appear out of nowhere and start writing something up there. And it says his legs gave way. He couldn't even stand up. He just, like, what is going on here? So he brings in all the soothsayers, all the magicians, and they couldn't read the writing. They couldn't give him the interpretation of it. And eventually, the queen reminded Belshazzar about Daniel. And he said, "Don't you remember this man Daniel, your father Nebuchadnezzar, or your ancestor Nebuchadnezzar? He told him these amazing interpretation before. You should bring him in, and he can read the writing." So we're going to read that now. Daniel 5 and verse 18. And this is Daniel responding to the king. He's not very happy with him. It says, "O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honour. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou, and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold and of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, Meeny, meeny, tickle you fasten. This is the interpretation of the thing. Meeny, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tickle, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Just one little aside here. You may wonder why the first time it says you fasten and the second time it says Perez. I've wondered that for a long time. Well, why does it say that? Why is it different? Perez is actually the singular Upharsin is the plural, just if you're wondering. This is exactly what happened. His kingdom, we know in history, tells us, not written by the Jews, by a Greek historian, I can't even say his name, Herodotus, that's the one, that the river that went under the wall of Babylon was diverted. The Medo-Persian Empire marched under there, captured the city that night, and that was the end of the Babylonian kingdom, and the Medo-Persians was the next kingdom. So, these chapter 4 and chapter 5, they're similar, but they include contrasts. So we know both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar exalted themselves, were proud. They were both humbled. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. However, he acknowledged and praised God and was restored. However, Belshazzar didn't, and he was judged. So these passages, similar story, but give us different endings on how you respond to the humbling of God. Okay. Oh, I forgot to show the pictures again. There he is, living as a beast. And there's the hand. There we go. We'll keep going. Okay. I'm going to try to sum up those chapters now. And okay. So chapter 2 was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And basically what that taught us is God will reveal himself to you, no matter who you are. He revealed himself to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. I guess the question is, if God reveals himself to you or comes into contact with you, will you listen? Will you follow? And if you listen, God actually has a plan for mankind, but also for you. And that plan includes an eternal kingdom. Chapter 3 was the story of the fiery furnace. And I guess what we can learn from that is God's people worship only him, no matter the consequences. But God will protect his faithful people in miraculous ways. Chapter 4, again, the story of Nebuchadnezzar living as a beast. I guess the message from this one, it's God that blesses. We need to give him the glory. But if we do lift up ourselves in pride, God can and will humble us. It's how we respond to that humbling. That's the important part. If you give God the glory, he can restore you. Chapter 5, which was the writing on the wall. This one is don't forget what God's done before. Belshazzar forgot what had happened before. Don't forget the blessings and the humblings. But if you continue rebelling against God, you will face judgment. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. That even though God may bless you, others may actually resent it and try to take away your blessing, which is what happened in that story there. But if you trust God like Daniel, he'll protect you. And finally, chapter 7, which is the vision of the beasts, is God knows the end from the beginning. We got to don't forget the bigger picture. God has a plan, and we're part of it. If we remain faithful despite the persecution, we have eternal life as well. Okay, so next couple of things I want to touch on. Going back to more the structural aspects of it. Chapters 2 and 7 act as a bookend to the Aramaic section. And that's, again, another very common technique within Jewish writing. And it was used to kind of define a section. This is a section. And to provide, an overarching framework or a concept about what that section is about. So some other examples in the Bible we can look at. Like on a really big level, the whole Bible is bookended. Starts off with the garden and the tree of life. And it ends up with the tree of life in the book of Revelation. You've got that bookending. Everything between that is about, this is where God wants us to be, but everything got muddled in the middle. It's about how to get back to that place. That's what the overarching story of the Bible, if you want to think about it like that. But even on a smaller level, for example, Matthew chapter 5, many of us are familiar with the Beatitudes of Jesus. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs are the kingdom of heaven, is the first Beatitude. And for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, is the part of it. And the last of those Beatitudes says, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That aspect, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, is the bookmark. It says this is a discrete section. Everything in there is about entering the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so this Aramaic section has that same structure. And I guess the implications of that is that that's what we're trying to read. When we read all of those sections, what Daniel was trying to get across and what we should try to understand is God is in control of everything. Everything that goes on, God is there. He knows the end, he knows from the beginning, and he has a plan no matter what we're going through in each of those circumstances. Then we got the middle section. And in a chiasm, the middle section is what they call the pivot point. It's another important part of the structure. And it's an emphasis, again. And it teaches us, it's a key teaching here, and the emphasis of this is that even though God knows everything, we still choose how we respond to God. Do we remain humble and get blessed, or do we become proud and become judged? So God knows everything, but we still have a choice. Okay, let's try to wrap this up in a second, soon, hopefully. So how does this apply to us? You might be wondering why I've been spending this long talking about Daniel, because that was thousands of years ago. Why am I talking about this? I think there's some similarities. We live in a society where many people do not know our God. Just like Daniel, they didn't know his God. How many people do not know God, don't believe God, or if they do believe in God, it doesn't seem to be the God that we know, the God who works in our life, the God who's changed us. So like Daniel, we need to introduce people to our God. So how do we do that? And I think we can learn some lessons from what Daniel did about how we introduce people to God. So think about what are the testimonies that we can share? Like Daniel shared the things he'd seen and heard to tell people about his God. What can we share about us? So I guess the first part, God is all-knowing. He knows the end from the beginning. And I think I'm going to go way over, so I'm just going to quote these verses. But in Ephesians 1, it says, according as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. What this tells me is God is all-knowing. God knew you from at the foundation of the world, and he chose you and he picked you for this moment. And knowing that, what do we share? We share our testimony how God called us. How did God call us? We've all got our own testimonies, how God called us in amazing ways. We also know that God has a plan and that we're a part of it. We can share that as well. Part of that plan is, I'm just going to quote for the sake of time, one of my favourite passages in Revelation 21. Here's part of that plan, that eternal kingdom that we heard about. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Now he that sat upon the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said unto me, write, for these words are true and faithful. We know these words to be true and faithful. So when we are sharing about the God we know, we can share about that hope, that there is a life to come. And this life is incredible. Next part was about worshipping God only. He protects those who are faithful. Again, I'm just going to quote from Psalm 91. He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I'll say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. A bit like Daniel shared the protection of God. What do? We share the testimonies, don't we? We've already heard our brother share testimony, just recent testimony with father, just this week. And we could be here. How many have we got here? Maybe 40, 50 people or so? If we all stood up here and we shared everything God had done for us, we wouldn't be leaving till sometime later this week. He's done amazing things. That's what we share. We know God's got a plan, that we can be a part of it, but He also does stuff for us now. The last part was around honouring God. Don't be proud or you'll be judged. In Matthew 5, it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So there is this, if you are humble, if you are meek, there is this promise of incredible blessings. However, we can't forget, in Psalm 16, verse 5, it says, "Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand joined in hand, he shall not be unpunished." And sometimes, quite rightly, we focus on all the good things, all the blessings, the miracles, the life to come, the no more tears, sorrow, all of that sort of stuff. We focus on that, but we can't forget the other side. Where there's blessings, there's also judgment, and that's part of God's nature. But when He judges justly. So I guess when we're sharing about our God, we can't forget that part. We have to remember that He is a God who judges. So He protects those who worship Him, but there's also judgment. Okay, I'll just quote one last verse, 1 Peter 3:15. "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." So if you had to sum up, I'll leave you one thought to think about. If you had to sum up what you knew about God and you were going to tell others, what would you say? I'll leave it there.